Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It's a tired class. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. You'll get the most out of this if you come all week. That's for sure. If you can't, you'll get the most out of it if you can come as often as you can. But in 5 days, I can't possibly cover everything that's relevant to this. So you need to understand that. So I'm going to show you the book, which I think will be helpful. And this session of classes, 5 classes, covers about 30% of the book. Now, there's 2 reasons we can't do this. First of all, it's a semester course. We don't have 14 weeks. And so this is the book. And I don't make any money on this book at all. I mean, I've written a bunch of books, and the money all gets donated to the work of the church. Since I'm not rich, I can at least give some talent to making some money for them. You need to look at the picture on the back, even if you don't buy the book. It's an interesting picture. Okay. Are you giving them away, right?
Yes.
Yeah. You see, it's a good deal. It's free. You know what? I think I'll take a couple myself back. No, because I back in our ecclesia, they're all out, and several people have been asking me one. So if you have any left over, yeah, we'll do it. All right. So this evening's class is on realistic expectations. We live in a world of unreality, really, when it comes to relationships. Does anyone here really like romantic movies? What they call chick flicks? Well, Mary and we love them. But they're totally unrealistic. I mean, they end with, usually it's a boy and a girl, there's some kind of conflict that keeps them apart, and then they get together, and they kiss, and the fairy tale ends with them marrying. They never show you them changing diapers, losing a job, getting illness, having in-laws who are creeps, having bosses that don't appreciate them, having children who turn out terrible. There's a million things in life happen after the fairy tale. So let's talk tonight about realistic expectation. Because if you get into a relationship and your expectations are totally off the wall, you're never going to be happy, because you now have measured your relationship against a standard that doesn't make sense in the real world. So tonight we're going to talk about realistic expectations. I just put the reading up there for you to take a look at yourself. I'm not going to read it tonight, but 1 Timothy chapter 6 is quite interesting about the apostles' expectations. So before we get started, I'm going to lift the curtain, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mary and myself, okay, and the kind of expectations we brought into our marriage. A lot of this book, by the way, I'd say 98% of it, when I wrote it, was about us and the things we learned as counseling. Then I ran it past my wife. My wife said, well, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And then I improved it. And everybody thinks you don't just write a book. It's a life experience. Gets rewritten, and every chapter is rewritten a number of times. It gets showed to other people. And so let's start with our roots, okay? I was born in Brooklyn, the best place to be born. About 50 million people in America actually have lived in Brooklyn at one time or other over the last 75 years. This is Bethel Hospital. The only part of it that was there was this part when I was born. As you can guess, Bethel means the house of God. It was a Jewish hospital. It was the only hospital within distance of public transportation, because my dad's car was busted at the time and he had to get it to a hospital. Imagine going on a bus to a hospital when you're pregnant and you're about to give birth. But that was the closest to the house. It was a couple of miles away. Here is where we are in Brooklyn. It's Brownsville. This was not really Brownsville, East New York. We lived about over here. Not the best neighborhood in the world. Very good, diverse neighborhood, though. I grew up with every race and every every ethnic background you can imagine. Brooklyn was a real melting pot in the 50s. This you used to be able to walk down to the bay and eat fresh clams and stuff. Today, this bay is so polluted, you could do that, but only once. After that, you'd be dead. So this is where I come. Now, Manhattan's over here. This is Brooklyn. Queens is over here. There is a meeting, a big meeting here in Ozone Park, and another meeting down here in the city. There was a meeting in Manhattan out here and one in the Bronx, and there were meetings that met and spoke only German. There was two meetings that were only Italian speaking, and there were meetings here that the one in Ozone Park has a lot of people from the Caribbean and from Guyana. And the meeting downtown Brooklyn at the time was almost all Italian speaking. Now, this is where can you see this? I'm not sure about whether the lights are killing some of the, yeah, maybe you want to close the lights for a second. This is actually where I grew up in Brooklyn, in a typical brownstone house. This is the third one in, is where I grew up till the age of 14. When we moved in, this house was built in 1890. We moved in 1944. It had no electricity at the time. It had gas lighting. And my dad pulled wires through the gas pipes to light up the house. To give you some idea, this was not a one-way street then. It actually had a bus route on it. And the corner over here was a candy store. It's boarded up now. The candy store actually never had much candy in it. And I didn't realize until I was almost 12, 13 years old. Why? Because in the back, there was lots of phones. It was actually a bookie joint. The candy store was just a front. Across the street was a bar, a very rousing bar, the first place to have television. And they used to let us kids look in through the windows to watch the games. And that's the first place I saw two of my absolute favorite players in history, Jackie Robinson and Duke Snider, play in 1947 by watching through the bar. We could go to Ebbets Field, but it was very expensive. It cost almost 50 cents to sit in the bleachers. And if you think that that's cheap, the minimum wage was 35 cents then. So you had to work a couple of hours just to go and sit in the bleachers. So this area here, it was actually two-family. Somebody else, we had a kitchen, dining room, bedroom. Upstairs was a bedroom, 2 bedrooms, and a small kitchen. And Mom and Dad rented out the upper part of the house. Okay, I went to school right across the street, Public School 159. A few years back, the school closed, or the facade, everything was falling off. It was disintegrating. It was about as bad as any school you get in inner cities today. The neighborhood, it was never that great a neighborhood to begin with. And they finally decided to redo it and restore it. So they've cleaned the brick, put in the facades. I actually never saw it like this in my lifetime. The school had been built in the 1920s. When I was going to the school, there was a girls' entrance on one side of the building and a boys' entrance on the other side of the building. We went in separate columns. Okay. We then moved in 1953 to a housing project. And that's where I lived until I went to college. This is Electchester. It was a housing project built by the Electrical Workers Union. And I believe that the building we lived in is this one. They've built some other high rises since then to overlook it. And in this area here, this little area in Queens, there were more people here than in the entire city or town where Mary grew up. I went to high school in Brooklyn. This is Brooklyn Technical High School. At the time, it had 6,000 students. We did not, as you can see, it's a pretty crowded area. We had no playing fields. You know, we spoiled people with all the land you have around here. Football practice, we practiced on the roof. The roof was all padded. So you practiced under this essentially screened area. That's where you practice your football on pads. Up in the tower was a radio station which had high school of the year for shut-ins, sick kids, kids who were disabled, and they would broadcast the classes to these kids so they could get an education over WNYC. This student place had 6,000 students. The village we live in Dexter, Michigan, has a total population of 4,000 people. So it was pretty crowded. I took a subway to come here, and then you'd walk up the block, and you went to school here. And when I only played football one year up here, and busted my knee, and I needed surgery about 50 years later to fix it. So that's the way it goes. All right, so the graduating class was 1,600 students. So once probably was the largest high school, one of the largest high schools in the country at the time. Built during 1933 under the Works Project Administration to teach kids technical skills. And this is how I got interested in engineering, actually. I had a teacher, Mr. Schrager, who encouraged me to go to college. And I think I was the first one in my family to actually graduate college, even though my mother's family had come here in 1867. I was the first one to actually graduate. And I think I'm still the only one to have gotten a PhD. Well, almost all my other cousins have gone to college by now. So here's where Mary lived. She lived at the very end of Long Island, and it's really a Long Island. It's 100 miles away from where I was working and where I lived. At the time, there was no interstate, no 495. It took about 4.5 hours to go that 100 miles because she went through a lot of small towns. And she was really spoiled. She grew up in this town where she spent her summers on the beach, and had plenty of land all around. The house she lived in was had a half acre of land. The first time I saw it, I thought she must have been infinitely rich. The first time I ever slept in my own bed, not with my brother, was when I went away to college. This is the school she went to. You'll notice the similarity. It's like a small-scale Brooklyn Tech because it was built about the same year under the Works Project Administration, and her graduating class was 39. So what kind of expectations do you think two people who brought up so very, very differently in different surroundings, a small-town girl, big city guy? I spent a lot of my high school years, I was picked to go to art training at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and they picked 5 kids from every high school in Brooklyn that could go there. And I was originally wanted to be an artist because my mother was an artist. And I made a startling revelation when I was a senior that I had no talent. So that kind of kills an artistic career. I was very good, however, at math and physics in high school. And so I decided, well, maybe I'd not make a good engineer or a good scientist, but definitely could not be a good artist. So those expectations were very different for the two of us when we got together. Her exposure to the world was very different from my exposure. So in ancient times, realistic expectations were a public event. This is one of my favorite artists, Peter Bruegel the Younger. In 1623, he painted this picture. He's a Flemish artist of a wedding procession. Here is the bride, and she's gone out to meet her fiancé to be married, and the whole village accompanies them. And so in times past, for Rome, actually 3,000 or 4,000 years, the bride was going to meet her husband, and it was a public event, and it was a public lifetime contract done in front of witnesses. That was the idea of a wedding. Some weddings then get recorded in the church, and they were in the church records. In fact, for a long time in Europe, there wasn't even a mechanism for divorce. So what about Mary and I? What kind of compatibility did we have? What kind of expectations did we have in 1957 when we met on a blind date? I don't know what expectations she had, but my expectations was to get through the date and not spend too much money. All right, that was the main goal. All right, I found out she liked Broadway show music and pop music, and I really didn't care for any of that. I liked opera and classical music. I told you my mother's sister, my Antoinette, she sang in the Metropolitan Opera chorus. My dad played clarinet in a jazz orchestra, and so I had a very different taste. She was Catholic, and I was a Christadelphian. I was Protestant. She was a quiet, pensive person, type B personality. She's not anymore. I kind of got her out of that shell a little bit. Now I find at times I may have overcompensated. So, and I am and always was a type A personality. We both like sports, however, especially basketball. We spent a lot of dates at Madison Square Garden. We both were technical analytical types. She was a nurse, training in nursing, which is a kind of analytical skill. And I am loyal to a fault, sometimes too trusting of people. Got me in trouble at times when I was managing people. I just wouldn't give up on people, even who were completely messing up. On the other hand, Mary can spot a phony in one conversation. So if you feel insecure or that you might have any phoniness about you, don't talk to my wife. She will figure it out, and she will tell me, stay away from that person. Sometimes I would, when I was interviewing someone for a job, I spent 14 years being a dean, I would take them out to dinner with my wife, let them talk for an hour or two. And then I'd take Mary's opinion. And 99% of the time, she was right. She'd say, you're going to hire this person, you're going to have trouble. The one or two times they didn't listen, I had trouble. I won't mention any names, right, darling? She had a character a lot like my mother. I think I mentioned that. And that's an important trait. And she was very different from her mother. Thank goodness. That's a very, very important point, too. She was very close to her father. Okay, so, but we shared one thing really important in common. Money and things didn't mean much to us. We didn't really go out to do anything. In fact, right now I got two really nice cars, but they're both used cars. I hate buying anything and let somebody else take the depreciation. We're quite content and happy to go to Goodwill, Salvation Army, and buy good stuff that other people just discard because we're a very wasteful country. A child might want something right now. That is the essence of immaturity. I want it now. But a mature person is willing to make sacrifices, to put aside and take care of things, and build for something. Well, one of my children, a very, very smart kid, he turned down an opportunity to go to grad school to get a PhD in computer science because he said, Dad, you work too hard for too little. So he went to work and got a job, a very good job. And the company said, well, we'll put you through grad school for your master's degree, but you got to go part-time. So he said, I don't think I want to do that. And it was pretty obvious he wasn't going to get very far in that company unless he did it. So we were talking one night, and he said, Dad, what do you think? It's going to take 5 years for me to finish it at night, and I'll be 33 years old when I finish. And I says, and how old will you be in 5 years if you don't do this? He said, I guess you're right. I said, so why don't you do it 1 year at a time? See how it works out. Well, he did it, got his master's degree, and he's very glad he did. It opened a lot of doors of opportunity for him that he wouldn't have had otherwise. So a mature person is willing to postpone fulfillment and work towards a goal without whining. And this is important in your relationship too. If you have problems, you got to be willing to work at it. There is no such thing as a perfect marriage. That is just unreal. And if you have problems or issues or things you're trying to achieve, if you work at it together and you have some sense that the goal is here, here's the goal, now how am I going to get to it? How are we going to get to it? As you remember, a marriage is a corporation. It's not a competition between two people. It's a cooperation between two people to achieve a goal. And the number one goal should be that you can make each other as happy as humanly possible. So when we went on our honeymoon, we didn't make any big deal about it. This is actually where we stayed, in Old Mystic, Connecticut, and we had a whole day there because we had to get back to work. And somehow, in between many years, we never got around to really having a honeymoon because I still had 5 years, almost 6 years of schooling to finish, master's, bachelor's, master's, PhD. And then when we had that, we had a kid. And by the time I graduated here, another one was on the way. And the middle one, he was always in a hurry. He's always been in a hurry. He came out in 7 months. And he weighed, 4 pounds? And he was not well. And we had a large amount of bills because I didn't have any insurance. The company I went to work for would not cover a pre-existing condition if it happened in the past 12 months. And obviously, since he was born only a few months after I was on the company, something must have happened before I got there. Now, I don't have to explain the details, right? So they wouldn't pay for it. So he had to go in a premium unit. He was in the hospital, all that. And by the time he came out, I owed $12,000 in medical bills. Now, you think that's not a lot of money today. But in 1966, I could have bought 4 Cadillacs for $12,000. So if you want to get the scale of it, it's more like owing $120,000, $130,000 today. It took me 5 years to pay it off. So, but in all of this, we didn't do any whining. We just, okay, that's reality. Let's work with it. Let's see how we can get around this and get ahead on the job and so on. All right, so we finally did get a honeymoon. But it was 55 years later, and we finally got to go and do what we wanted to do. Now, I'm not saying we never traveled or did anything in between, because we did do a lot of traveling, but it was always because I went somewhere to work. So when I went to England to work at Oxford and on sabbatical for a year, and I went there to do, family come along, but I always had other things to do. We never just had a time. We just sit down, be romantic, and don't do anything. I make a real honeymoon on it. So we finally decided, you know what, we're going to take a month off, and we are going to do nothing but have fun. So we went, and we went to Naples, which is where my family on my mother's side left to come to the United States. And I had never really spent any time in Naples. And we went to the opera there. And in the Opera House in Naples is interesting because it has the oldest opera house in the world, 1739. And then we went to the hotel which we wanted to go to for our honeymoon. And it's called the Grand Hotel Villa Cervelloni. That's Mary sitting right there. And she always wanted to swim in this pool. But when she put her feet in and found out they don't heat the pools in Italy, all she did was ended up wetting her feet. But this is a beautiful hotel. It was an old castle, and converted to a hotel in the 19th century. And the food, the restaurants over here and down here, the food is really wonderful. And so they baked us a cake. We finally got a wedding cake. And they brought it to our room. Our rooms, actually, we had a suite. And we ate this cake all week long. We gained about 6 pounds eating this cake. It's just really rich. So that's a real postponement of fulfillment. I don't advise you to do this. If you're going to have the time and the money, go on a real honeymoon now. Enjoy it. Set the stage. But what were the expectations before all of these things? Well, in the Bible, expectations were set by the family. And so you have the case of ages past, the parents chose the partnership. Now, I can guarantee you that if my parents and Mary's parents, I don't know about my parents, my mother probably would have chose Mary, but I doubt that her mother and father would have chosen me, okay, for many, many reasons. They didn't want to marry a big city boy. They didn't want to marry someone who was Italian. They were from New England, very waspy. A lot of little things. The idea that the parents choose goes way back. Genesis 24, 3 and 4. You will not take a wife, this is Abraham speaking, you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but I will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. And you can see immediately what he was saying, what we talked about last night. He wanted to pick something with a familiar background, where the spiritual side of it would be matched by his family because the Canaanites were fairly evil people. And he wanted to choose something that would fit and make his son happy both spiritually and materially. So he sends his servant Eliezer, and Eliezer finds Rebekah taking water at the well and serving him. And by her service, Eliezer, I believe, right away understood that this woman was a woman who was a giver, not a taker. So the idea of romantic love is actually very, very new. I mean, we've come to believe that this is the only thing to do. It's actually only in the past 100 years out of 6,000 years of human history that the word dating even exists. And so the idea today is you keep matching yourself up with various and sundry opposite sex until you meet the one that somehow a light bulb goes off over your head, or you see stars, or wow, it's been marvelous. And I'm not quite sure. I honestly have to say that in my own case, a light bulb did go over the head, or either that or Mary hit me over the head. I'm not sure which one it was, but she definitely made an unbelievable impression on me on the first date. But the idea of dating, does that mean that's better than when parents chose? I'll tell you the truth, both have their problems. The parents might have had wisdom and what made a good couple, but they might not have understood the emotional attachment that went between the people. On the other hand, I know people from cultures, and I've had students where the parents still picked, and they made pretty good marriages. Also, people who've been in that situation were totally mismatched. And dating doesn't guarantee a perfect match either. The very statistics that you have over 100, out of every 100 marriages, 50 of them are going to fail. And I would bet that 99 of them were through the dating process. What's wrong? What kind of expectations are brought into a marriage that makes a marriage fail? Sometimes it's not only what's brought in, it's how it changes in the course of life. No one can say today exactly what kind of person you're going to be 10 years from now. What kind of things will happen to you as a result of job stress, as a result of various other events in your life, illness, dealing with children. There's all kinds of things that impress on your relationship that don't make a relationship frozen and chiseled in concrete that stays the same its whole life. So having realistic expectations is not just at the beginning of a relationship, but it's one you have to have all through a relationship. So when parents or guardians chose marriage partners, the presumption was that they were mature adults who knew what would make a good match. That was the premise for 5,000 or so years. Did this always lead to happy marriages? Not really. But neither has the process of dating. In both these cases, something else comes into play, something that we have to be aware of. So there's some important scriptures on marriage that I want to point out to your attention. If I go over here, is the microphone? Okay. Okay, first, Genesis 2:24. It's an important one to note down because this is repeated a number of times in scriptures. This statement, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, the idea here, it's the second chapter of the Bible, puts down a real important rule. The husband and wife are not to be tied to their past parental relationships in such a way that it interferes with their marriage. That is extremely important. Why? Well, the substance of this teaching is repeated 4 more times in the New Testament. The Lord Jesus Christ repeats it, which should give you a hint of how important it is, and the Apostle Paul repeats it. So I have a rule. It's called John Bolello's Rule 21-B7. If something is repeated in Scripture a number of times, no, maybe it was 21-8. I don't remember exactly which rule I made up. But the important thing is that when something is repeated in Scripture, especially in the New Testament and the Old Testament, God is saying to us, this is important, pay attention. Now, anyone else in here a teacher? Anyone here been a teacher? Okay, so you know the rule, right? Repeat it, repeat it, repeat it. If you don't do that, students rarely get it. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to repeat it, repeat it, repeat it. I had a rule at the university. I would give it to them in the lecture. I would give it to them in the reading. I would give it to them in the homework. And then when I gave it to them on the exam, they would all say, he never told us anything about that, right? Isn't that typical? But I'd had it all documented. Scripture rarely wastes a word. So when something is repeated, God is telling us, pay attention. So look at what the Lord Jesus Christ says. Why would he quote all the way back to Genesis? It didn't have a lot to do with parables or anything else. He was talking to us about this is a very important step in a relationship. He was answering and he said to them, not have you read that the Creator from the beginning, a male and female he made them, and said, on account of this shall leave a man the father and the mother, and shall be closely united to the wife of him, and shall be the two into one flesh. This idea of closely united. Now, Mark again repeats the same thing in another site. God made them male and female, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. Now, I got to tell you, that I had to learn this lesson too. My mother was very close to my mother. That's a good and a bad thing. But my mother was a real interferer if I had let her. Because my mom had a certain way of doing things. Ever put 2 women in the same kitchen where one is the mother-in-law and the other is the mother? Not a good combination. So this idea of holding fast means that your first priority has to be your relationship with your wife or your husband. The Apostle Paul repeats the same thing, 1 Corinthians 6:16. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? Why is he repeating this? Because you were supposed to hold fast to your wife. So if you go out and have multiple relationships with other women, you're not holding fast to her anymore. So morality was a big issue in the first century because there were a lot of places, in fact, pagan religions actually fostered this. And I think, unfortunately, in the world today, we take a very loose attitude towards promiscuity. It's like, so what? No harm done, as long as 2 people agree, who cares? But what it does is it undermines a relationship and the trust that 2 people have to have for each other. And that is something that is awful, impossible, almost impossible to recover from if the husband or the wife is cheating on the side. That just breaks down a relationship of trust that's almost impossible to heal again. And then Paul tells the Ephesians, for no one has ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. So he compares the love of Christ for the church to the love that we should have for each other. Isn't that a beautiful comparison? That's to me, that is just so powerful. He says, therefore, and the therefore links this passage, the love of Christ for the church, and we would hate to think that Christ doesn't love his own, Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So the analogy that he draws here is incredibly powerful, because would we like to think that Jesus is going to be unfaithful to us? Would we like to think he's going to break his promises? Would we like to think that everything Christ taught was fake? I don't think so. So what is the first principle? That the partners in a marriage must hold fast to each other. Second, it applies to prior relationships, whether it be with friends or family. It applies to forsaking all immorality. And it applies to the woman as well as the man. In another place in Psalms, he says, O daughter, and consider and incline your ear, forget your people and your father's house. So it's a mutual thing. So the critical concept here is to focus on the principle that a marriage constitutes a new blended relationship. And it requires the couple to establish their own identity, independent of the households in which they were raised. Now, I can tell you in our own marriage, we picked up a lot from each other's upbringing, but we brought a lot of it that we invented and discovered ourselves. Would you agree with that, sweetheart? So she's agreeing with. So either I got her trained or it actually happened. I'm not. If you know Mary, you know it actually happened. So now, I want to put a little caveat in. This doesn't mean you go and hate your parents. It doesn't mean you have nothing to do with your other relatives. That's not what it means at all. It doesn't mean that couples forsake all social interactions with their parents, siblings, other relatives, or prior friendships. But it does mean they don't let their past adversely interfere directly or indirectly in working out their new relationship. I still love my mother. They'd still come over for dinner every Sunday. But if my mother started criticizing my wife, I'd take her aside and say, Mom, you don't really need to do that. You shouldn't be doing that. If she didn't like the way Mary decorated something or cooked something, my mother soon learned it. The funny thing about doing this is that in the end, you will actually gain more respect for your family. In the end, my mother had such a good relationship with Mary that they actually at times could give and take. But my mom knew that if she tried to push something on Mary, that she had to deal with me. So that's another rule I want you to consider. If it's your parents that are giving the relationship a problem, don't tell your wife to go and deal with it. And if it's her parents that are giving the problem, don't tell your husband to go and deal. You need to deal with your side of the family. You don't need to put your spouse in the position of being the bearer of bad news. If my mom had a problem, I would go and tell her. With her mother, you deal with your mother. I don't want to be put in the middle of this. Huh?
Another thing I think at this point to remember, like not divorcing yourself, but being separate from your parents and your family. You have an argument. You have a fight with each other. And believe me, you will. You don't run home to mommy and complain. You work it out yourselves. I don't know if you're going to say this later, but
No, it's
I
fine.
think this is a good time to put that in. You have to learn to stand on your own feet together as a couple.
That's good. Actually, I wasn't going to say that, so thank you. But that is a very important point. Too often, that actually draws the battleground wider. And what you really need to do is to work it out between yourselves. There is probably nothing worse than enlarging an argument. Okay. Now,
What might happen is your mother will take sides with your partner, And you don't want that either.
Right. So I want to make this important. It doesn't, as I said, you don't disown them at all. In fact, I would say that once the first couple of years, we really did have some sorting out because my mom was very close with her two sons, very close. And her mother was a very controlling person. And they had to learn their place. And then in later years, until they died, actually, everybody came together for holidays. We all had a good time. And they gradually learned. In fact, at one time, I actually told her father, I said, don't you have enough problem with Nora? She doesn't have to have the problems with us. And he went, you're right, John. Okay. And I think if you do this and you don't spill over the problem to the rest of the family, you'll find in the end you'll have better relationships all around. Because the worst thing you can do is call up. I disagree with Mary. Call mom. Hey, Mom, you know what Mary's doing? I don't know. I never do that. Because all of a sudden you've enlarged the theater of where you have the problem. Okay, so expectations versus reality. The reality is you will have these conflicts. And the important thing is to learn how to handle them. Okay? So here's an example of the kind of problems that happen. I always thought, never mind, he says what? In this marriage, I always thought there would be more nachos. So it points out something here that one of the biggest conflicts we had early in our marriage was my mother saying, she's not Italian. You're going to starve. She doesn't know how to cook. And so they came over our apartment one day, and Mary decided she's going to show them. So she didn't tell me this and that because I was busy and I wasn't able to do the cooking that day. And she put a bunch of pork chops in the broiler and didn't put them up on a rack. She didn't know you had to put them up in a rack. So the fat sort of laid in the pan with the pork chops, and when it got to a certain temperature, it ignited. And a big fire came out of the. So it's funny today, it wasn't so funny at the time. And I still remember my dad trying to put out a pork chop fire. It's not easy. Very well, yeah. I think he got Minza pull it up. Right, so there may not be more nachos, but you know what? I still don't like pork chops. They still got this thing about pork chops. Anyway, so expectations always come from our past. If somebody marries someone with a really different background, I had to learn that certain expectations that we both had to learn are not going to happen. And this is something that we're not always totally aware of, because as we grow up, a whole bunch of things are implanted in our brain that we take for normal. For example, I have a daughter-in-law who the first time she came over the house with her son, we happen to like mushrooms. So I made fantastic sauteed mushrooms with garlic and olive oil. It's terrific. Only to find out she had never eaten a mushroom in her whole life. She looked at it and was like, oh, that's really weird. And so I just don't serve mushrooms to her anymore. She just, and not that she's allergic, nothing. She just has never had them. It's a strange thing. It's kind of water under the bridge. But the worst problem about expectations is, and has been proven over and over again, is financial. More marriages break down because of financial stress than any other issue. And it's because people can't differentiate what they need from what they want. So if you say to yourself, I need this, you better make sure that you actually do need it. You better make sure that both you and your spouse agree that you need it. There's probably nothing worse than one or the other going out and spending a lot of money on something the other doesn't know anything about, and it undercuts your whole budget. Time and again in counseling in our church, the biggest problem young people get in is credit card debt. Because it is so easy today to charge and charge and charge. We've had cases where people charge couple tens of thousands of dollars of stuff and not able to pay it. Now, I tell you, I'm in favor of complete surgery on this. We had a situation in our life after we got out of grad school and everything. We had all those bills with our son being a preemie, and they were starting school, and I got a bill at the end of the month, and it was almost my, half my annual salary. And Mary says to me, "Well, I had it. They needed this. They needed that. I said, "Yeah, but we've got to spread it out or find cheaper places." And the next month, another bill. And after several months of this, I said, "Sweetheart, you're going to have to find a richer guy to marry because there's no way we can pay these bills." I took all the credit cards. There weren't a lot of them. I cut them all up, threw them away. I said, "From now on, until we get stable and pay off the debt we owe from the medical, here's how much money we got each month. Here's the cash. When there's no more cash, that's out of it." And it took about a couple of years, right? And we got out of it. Now I got 20 credit cards. By the way, if you're ever in trouble with your spouse and she's mad at you, there's 2 magic words you can say. Charge it. That'll get you out of trouble. But why is it so easy? Because in America, we are inundated with advertising that encourages us to overspend and to not be wise about it. So here's what's happened. Financial conflicts rank very high among the reasons that married couples eventually split. In fact, it's the number 1 reason. That surprised me. In recent survey taken in a cosmopolitan Midwest city, the city was Minneapolis, money problems outranked infidelity and physical abuse as major causes leading to divorce. The wedding vow, "till death do us part," has become, in the thoughts of many couples, "till debt do us part." Out of USA Today, September 28, 2011 article, 40.3% of divorces come about because of the way the spouse handles money. 34% infidelity and 12% physical abuse. So these are not good numbers, but the thing that struck me is that fighting over how to spend money is the biggest problem. And that comes from unrealistic expectations. Probably nothing worse than, there's two things that drive that I found in counseling people. Either one of the spouses comes from a very rich family and is used to everything, and the other one doesn't. Or one of them comes from a very poor family and wants to catch up. I'm going to make some very concrete suggestions here. Hills and valleys can derail our expectations. Both partners need to come to a marriage being seriously devout for richer or poorer. I have been times in our lives when we were a lot poorer and times when we had money. It was not, the graph didn't go like this up to riches. It was more like that. We had good times, bad times. When I got out of the job at the phone company, the next job paid half what I was earning. And different issues happened. Life has its hills and valleys, and one can't guarantee that sorrows will never come. I mean, we didn't expect to have a premature child. It happened. I didn't, we didn't plan it that way. The previous firstborn only cost us $135 or something in medical bills and a couple of days in the hospital. 2 years later, it cost us 5 Cadillacs. We didn't plan it that way. We didn't know about that. Sickness, loss of a job, temptations, loss of a loved one, many other difficulties can cause a marriage to crash down or a relationship in general. We're not always in control of everything around us. And we have to worry about each other and how to get through it. So there's a lot of good biblical advice on this stuff. The Apostle Paul, he realized that life is not one bed of roses. He says, "Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in what whatever situation I am, to be content. That's in Philippians 4:11. What's the story? If you got lemon, make lemonade. If you have a problem in life and you look at it that it's going to defeat you, it will. If you are in a tough situation, you can sit down and think about, what can I do to make it better? And it rarely will get better if you don't work at it together. In another place, he tells the Apostle Timothy, now there is a great gain in godliness with contentment. So why are people often discontent? It goes back to what I said a few slides earlier, because we can't differentiate between what we want and what we actually need. It's probably the greatest disease of Western industrialized countries all over the world. It's not just the United States. Every product you see on television gets sold by making someone feel that they have to be one up on somebody else. I mean, I love the car commercial where the guy drives in with the Buick, and wow, he's got a brand new Buick. And the neighbor next door was washing his old jalopy, and he's got to go out and get a brand new Buick, or whatever the car is. We're constantly being pushed to outdo the guy next door. You know, if you live your whole life like that, I can guarantee you, you'll never be happy. Quick story. When I was managing a lot of people, I had a guy working for me who came in one year, had his annual review, and he says to me, John, I really did a good job this year. I went through all the list of things he did, and he says, I deserve a good raise. And I said, you know, that budget's pretty tight and all that, but you made a pretty good case. I'm going to get you the best raise I can get in the college and get you a 10% raise. He said, that's great. I'm really happy. The wife and I can be really happy. I'll never bother you again. Next year he came to my office. He had a really bad year, and he didn't do so many good things at all. And I said, you know, I'm kind of disappointed. And he said, well, you know what? You only gave me a 10% raise, so I didn't think it was worth working that hard. You know what? Some people are never happy. They're never happy. But we have food and clothing. With these, we will be content. I think of my son, Matt, who's been working the last 3 years as a missionary in Africa. And he says, Dad, there are some days that our biggest problem is not preaching the gospel. It's seeing that everyone gets fed. We don't have to worry about that in most cases here in the United States. He says, keep your life free from love of money, not free from money, but love of it. If your goal in life is always, I've got to have more, then you will never be happy. It's the love of money that drives more people and more marriages into the dumps. And be content with what you have, for he said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And here is the ultimate immaturity. If we believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, if we believe in the things he preached, if we believe that the kingdom will come on earth and that he will reward the righteous, that's a long-term goal. If we really say we believe that, then we're willing to conform our life to his life. And if we're willing to do that, then we know that whatever happens in this life, our life is this big compared to the immense immortality that Jesus has offered us. So sometimes we need to step back and look at the big picture. If I'm so busy working, if I'm so busy doing things that get me away from having a good relationship with my spouse, from having a good spiritual life, then I'm a mess. So here's some practical advice. Make a budget and stick to it. Now, that is really important. Maybe I'm too much of a kind of math type, but we've done that for many, many, many years. If we know how much we got, we're going to spend within that limit. We're not going to charge beyond. I got in the habit, in fact, I think it's probably been 30 years since I didn't actually pay off a credit card bill in full each month. And why? Do you realize credit card companies charge you higher interest than the mafia? Seriously, 18%. I can get a loan from the mafia for 12%. At least I think so. So what you don't realize is when you get yourself in a hole, the hole is opening faster than you can fill it. So you ought to get in the habit of making a budget and try to live within that budget and not overspending. If something happens that you don't expect, you have a cushion. Okay? If you cannot control your credit card spending, then get rid of them. And I'm not telling you something I didn't do. It got to the point we just could not handle it, and we got out of it and got into a different mode. Owe no one anything, the apostle says in Romans 13:8. Now, did he think he said that to punish us? No. He said because you're going to live a lot more peaceful life. And I'll tell you, you have a lot better marriage without any stress every month of whether I can pay the bills. There are community resources such as Salvation Army, Goodwill, very good clothes, household items that can be attained at little cost. And you'd be amazed what people throw away. We're probably the most wasteful society in the entire history of this planet. Actually, we actually went to Goodwill over in Savoy the other day, and my wife saved me a lot of money by spending a lot of money. Okay, so that's all for tonight on that. And I got one question already. Have you got some more questions?
You didn't want to put Bugs Bunny up there?
You're making life too easy for me. I'm sorry.
You didn't want to put Bugs Bunny up there? Bugs Bunny.
Bugs Bunny, that's all, folks. Bugs Bunny used to pop out with all.
I get what he says, but I honestly don't know how to do it. That's the best I am at over here. You're better at graphics. Show me how to do that. I got two.
Yeah, John, not a question, but a comment. Something I used to teach consumer education, and that drove home a lot of the same points that in teaching high school students. I was like, how can I tell them to do these things if I'm not doing these myself? And that really got me on the path to do that. So I followed that over many, many years. And About.com I found is a very terrific resource.
Good.
A lot of experts.
You want to repeat that again, that website, because I forgot to put it down.
About.com.
About.com, yeah.
And a weird twist of irony here. The credit card industry, as I understand it, call people to pay their bills in full each month deadbeats.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They don't like that at all.
Yeah.
They don't like that at all. Yeah. If you try to apply for an additional credit card, for example, and you find that you've been very faithfully paying off your bill every month, you actually get it. So I got, I got 3 questions on one of you. Okay, let's do this one first. Any advice on balancing work ambitions and time with the family? That's a good question. Could we shut that? My eye, thank you. Great, that's better, and I can stand it. Thank you very much. So, how do you balance? I think that is probably the biggest difficulty in terms of juggling your career versus your family and versus your church. I was a scientist for many years, and I know there were guys in my department who almost would never go home. They were just absolutely, they were determined to publish every paper they could ever publish, get every grant they could ever grant, be the most successful Nobel Prize winning scientist ever. I decided quite early in my career that it was very unlikely I was going to win the Nobel Prize because I wasn't smart enough. And secondly, I discovered, and I really studied this up, most Nobel Prize winners have average intelligence. And what really separated them was their absolute dedication to work extremely hard for as many hours as possible on an important problem. So I got some good advice here at Illinois from my advisor. He said this, it was Professor Marv Metzger, who passed away some years ago. He said, John, when you get out, try to work on hard problems. Because if you solve them, you can make your reputation. And if you don't solve them, you can say, well, nobody else did either. So I was fortunate enough to pick stuff that other people couldn't do. And so I didn't have to immerse myself in trying to get into a race where everybody was doing the same thing. I also got in the habit that at the end of the day, 5 o'clock, I went home. I went home. Because you know what? The lab was still there the next day. So how do you balance it? Well, you need to decide for yourself, is my family the most important career? Or is my job the most important career? What do I get out of working more and more hours? More money? Does my family need more money? Can we live within what we're doing? I think most people get caught up in the rat race because that's what drives you to be successful. But if you can balance saying my first priority, to me, my first priority was my family, second priority was my church, third priority was the job. And I put them in that order. So I got in a situation, and here's an interesting, you say about balancing it. So because I was a pretty conscientious guy, I found that when I was first an assistant professor, I ended up getting put on 4 different committees. And everybody else in the department was on 1. And I went into the chairman and I says, how come I'm on 4 committees and blah, blah, was on 1? He says, well, you do such a good job that I decided that I might as well give it to you to do because I can't trust those other guys. So I said, I got it. If I'm going to really have the time to do things, I got to go and do a lousy job for you. And he said, now that you put it that way, I said, you know what? I'm not serving on any more than 1 committee. I will do the best job you ever had on that committee. But you need to balance it around because you are taking so much time away from my research and my time, and it's starting to hurt my family, and I'm not going to do that. So sometimes you got to make some tough decisions. I talked it through with him. He didn't like it. In the end, I don't think I got a good pay raise that year, but I was a lot happier for not being worn out and doing stuff that took me 60 hours a week to do instead of 40, 45 hours a week. So I think the simple answer to this is that you have to decide what your priorities are. And if your job gets in the way of those priorities, you need to talk it through with your boss. You need to see if you can reach some kind of sense of balance. In most cases, if you're a good, hard, honest worker for everything else, I think I know when I got to be a boss, I cut people slack who I knew were doing a good job for me, and I didn't pour more stuff on them. Okay, I got here. What happens if there's a divorce pending during a time when someone is planning on getting married in a relationship somewhere else in the family? That's an interesting question. I think what I was saying earlier about don't let family issues outside of your own relationship interfere with what you have to do. Your first priority is always to your spouse or your intended spouse. And people will have difficulties other places in your family, and you have to ride through it. I have a brother who's had lots of problems in life, and every time we got involved, I had to cut it at a certain point because otherwise it would have driven us crazy. How do you work through issues that your spouse has experienced before? Dishonesty, expecting perfection, and is now expecting the same treatment from you. Somebody is married here to, or who expects you to be perfect. I don't know who gave me these questions because it looks like two different handwritings, or maybe it's just me. How do you do work on now expecting the same treatment from you? Well, if your if your spouse is expecting perfection, does the spouse give you perfection? Is anyone here married to a perfect, other than me, married to a perfect spouse? I think.
What am I going to say when my wife plays the state back?
I think this comes under the rubric of, if you're expecting something from me that you are not doing, then we have a problem. We need to sit down and talk it through. There's going to be times in any marriage when the other partner is used to something, wants something their way, and it's outside of the box of the partner who's having a conflict with you. All I can tell you is that is going to happen. And the only way to get through it is to sit down and say, honey, here's a cup of tea. Or in my case, here's a nice cappuccino. Let's talk this out. Now, one of the good things about my relationship with Marion is we're both good talkers and we're also good listeners. One of the biggest problems that you find in arguments is that one of the persons or the other, or maybe both, are so busy thinking about what they're going to say next that they never hear what the other partner's saying. You want to add to that? Because I think we've seen this a lot of times in counseling.
Well, number one, nobody's perfect.
Oh, wow. Remember this, I got a lot of witnesses here.
I'm not perfect. I have flaws, one or two. Was something I was thinking of. You have to remember, John said talk. Don't scream and yell. I have a habit of being a yeller. And he has to calm me down and to talk calmly and to think calmly. Don't yell at each other because nobody hears anything when you yell.
Yeah, try to keep the emotional level controlled. Because you get it, you'll see, tomorrow you're going to see how to handle, tomorrow you're going to really see how to handle conflict. So I don't think I'll talk more about it now. Tomorrow really the session will be a lot on how to overcome obstacles and how to handle conflict. Very important. Because there is no such thing, as she said, no such thing as a perfect marriage. You will have conflict. But the way you handle it will decide whether you're going to move on and have a happy relationship, as opposed to, I go my way, you go your way. Okay? Let's see, you got another question here.
There are times when you can just agree to disagree.
Right. And I'm going to preempt a little what I'm going to say tomorrow, too. You don't have to win just because you're right. You hear what I'm saying? Sometimes enough is good enough. Okay, how can you set boundaries with overzealous, protective parents without offending? Oh, that's a good one. We got a little experience with that, don't we? Over setting boundaries, overzealous, protective without offending.
Thank you very much, Mom. I appreciate your input, but let us work it out.
Two
I
things.
mean, that's simple, that's a real simple, but I think that's the essence of it.
What Mary's telling you goes back to what I said about midway through this talk. She had to handle her parents, I handled mine. My mother could be overzealous at times. My mother was definitely a perfectionist. I would never let her Mary and her get into each other. I would say, hey, Mom, okay, Mary's not you. She's got her own style of doing this, and I love it. And I love you too, but I'm not going to love you if you're going to get into constant battles with my wife over something as silly as the way she makes chicken cacciatore. Was it chicken cacciatore or was it the baked chicken?
No,
Had to be Italian.
well,
No, I'm giving you a real incident. I mean, I don't make these things up. Real life is much stranger than anything you could make up. And the temptation, you don't want to push your parents away either. You want to make them draw in and realize that you love this person and you want them to love them too, even though they may be a little bit different from what you have in mind. And you can only do that by handling the situation in a loving way. I would never scream or yell at my mother. I'd take her outside, have a little quiet talk. Hey, Mom, we got to talk. Or I'd go over their house and bring a box of chocolate. Chocolate's very good, by the way. Chocolate, it always works. And say, hey, Mom, we need to chat. And you know what? When you set these boundaries early in the marriage, it actually gets easier. I mean, after the first few years and everything, it kind of evaporated away because the boundaries are now set. My mom knew that, if she didn't like the way Mary cooked something, she wouldn't say anything. And if, her mother didn't like the way I did something, she could just keep quiet because she knew where the boundary was then. But if you don't set those boundaries when they first happen, then the boundary keeps slipping and sliding more and more, and you have more and more trouble dealing with it. So if you have a situation in the family now, deal with it now. Don't postpone it. Don't think that it's going to get better in 2 years. It won't. You'll just make it harder to deal with. Okay, I think I answered all the questions that I'm going to do for tonight. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your attendance. Tomorrow we're going to talk about how to overcome obstacles. And we're going to go into some really depth and I think some practical suggestions of how to deal with conflict. Okay? So until then, thank you very much for coming. I've been really appreciative. If every class was as smart as this class, I would have still be teaching. Thank you. Good evening.
How's that for time?
Hey,
Not bad, not bad.